Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at interpreting the Gospels in our continuing study of hermeneutics. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all tell the story of Jesus. I love the story. This is actually a true story. A little girl who had just come to Christ, and somebody told her she had to read in the Bible stories about Jesus, and they were found in these four books. And so she read Matthew, she read Mark, she read Luke, she read John, and she said, "Oh my goodness, I don't understand. They kept crucifying him again and again and again." And of course, what she didn't realize, she did, later on, that these were four independent stories, somewhat independent, all telling the same story. And so you ask the question, well, how are they similar? They tell essentially the same story. They tell the story of Jesus, and they all end on the same note with his death, his burial, and his resurrection. But there are also some differences. You see, how are they different? Matthew presents Jesus probably from a Jewish perspective. There's a lot of Jewish elements that are particular to Matthew. Mark presents him as the servant, and there's a term that Mark uses a lot in the Gospel of Mark. He used the word immediately. The servant of the Lord is just rushing around, and he's going from here to there, and after a while, you begin to think, Mark, does that word immediately mean what you think it means? It's used so very often. Luke is the gospel that has those long story parables. They're specific to Luke, especially in the central part of Luke. And then John presents him as the Son of God. Although all the gospels do that, in John, that is his special emphasis. Now, all four gospels begin with a statement of the true identity of Jesus. And then they go on to prove that statement so that Matthew starts off, Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, the record of the genealogy of Jesus. Notice Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham, but he's presenting Jesus as the Messiah. And he says so right in the first verse. But then the rest of the book is to present how we can know that Jesus is the Messiah. Mark starts off in the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now notice um, the gospel, by the way, the word Christ and Messiah, that's the translators actually doing something there. It's the same word in the Greek text. Messiah is how you say it in Hebrew, but actually our copy of Matthew is written in Greek. So the translators are trying to maybe catch some of that Jewish flavor by using a Jewish term, but it's the same word. Um, but Mark seems to be written more for a Gentile audience. I think perhaps specifically for a Roman audience. And there's some things that are in Mark that a Roman audience would pick up on. For example, Matthew, I said, seems to be written to a Jewish audience. There are a lot of references to the Old Testament prophets. Mark has some references to the prophets in the dialogue, but Mark himself, as he is the narrator, he hardly mentions the Old Testament at all. Once right in chapter 1, and after that, he doesn't do that, except as it comes up in the dialogue. Luke is the storyteller. Now, as the storyteller, notice Matthew and Mark both in the first verse say who Jesus is. Luke, you actually have to get into the story to see that. So when you get still in chapter 1, but about verse 35, where Mary is being told about this child that she's going to have, and the angel tells her the holy child shall be called the Son of God. So it still tells you about that identity of Jesus, but you have to read a bit into the story before you get to that point. And then, of course, John starts off, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And you find out down in verse 14 that this Word became flesh. So all four Gospels in the first chapter, if not in the very first verse, tell of the true identity of Jesus. And that's what they are about. They're telling the story of Jesus, but they're telling the story of Jesus in a way that you will come to the conclusion that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Notice how John puts it, that he was God. Now, Matthew starts off with some introductory material. There's a genealogy, and then there's the birth of Jesus, the baptism and the temptation. Couldn't fit all of that in here. And then when you hit chapter 5, there's the first of 5 sermons, and there's going to be 5 sermons, each introduced by a historical narrative that's at least a chapter, sometimes more long. So chapter 4, you have Jesus calling his disciples, and then chapter 5 is the first sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. And there's going to be 5 sermons and or narratives, but 5 long teaching periods. And then at the end, of course, is the death, burial, and the resurrection, which is going to be in all 4 Gospels. Mark, by contrast, starts off with a very short introduction, just one verse, and then you have a reference to the baptism of Jesus, just a few verses, not a lot of detail, no mention of the temptation, and then you jump right into the public ministry of Jesus, leading up to the central part of Mark is when Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" And one of the disciples is Peter, who answers, "You are the Christ." That's sort of the climactic part, right smack in the middle of the book, and then from there you move to more private ministry. Up to that, he's been doing miracles and he's been in the public eye. He doesn't necessarily stop that, but now he's spending more and more time with his disciples, or at least the camera is there as the narrator focuses upon the private ministry of Jesus. And then you come to the end again, you're going to come to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. In Luke's account, it gives actually a 2-chapter introduction that give the birth both of John the Baptist and then the birth of Jesus, the announcement and then the birth of those 2 children. And then there's even a part where Jesus is 12 years old. That's found in Luke. And then you jump into the ministry of Jesus, and it's got a focus especially in the miracles of Jesus. Miracles, you've got some preaching, some teaching, but it's mostly his miracles. In chapter 9, verse 51, that's the pivotal point in the book. In the middle of it says, "And Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem." Now, that doesn't mean we're already that death, burial, and resurrection. Now, as he's going to Jerusalem from chapter 9 to around chapter 20, 21, somewhere in there, he's going to be giving those long story parables. And those are all found on the road, on that journey to Jerusalem, where first he's leaving Galilee and he's going to Samaria, and then he's in Samaria, then he's leaving Samaria and he's going to Jericho, and he's coming into Jericho, and then he's going out of Jericho, and he's getting closer and closer and closer to Jerusalem. And at the end, there is the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. When you compare the synoptic gospels with the Gospel of John, the synoptic, when I say synoptic gospels, that's, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they're called that because they have some similarities. Even though we looked at the differences, they have quite a few similarities, quite a few instances where they're saying almost word for word the same thing, and they tend to emphasize repentance and the kingdom inheritance. John, instead, he does mention the kingdom, but his emphasis is upon the eternal life inheritance. And so John is quite a bit different. They're still telling the same story, but in a very different way. John is so very different. Um, the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, describe the various historical events that are taking place. John does that, but he especially reflects on the meaning of those events. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they tend to just give you the facts, whereas John gives you the facts, then explains what it means. And so John gives much more commentary in his gospel account. The synoptics focus more on the short sayings of Jesus. Yes, it's true that Matthew has those 5 sermons or discourses, but John also has a number of sermons, and so you have some of the longer discourses. Think about the time when Jesus is speaking with Nicodemus, and it actually turns into a teaching time, not just with John, but with John the writer and us, or the conversation Jesus has with the Samaritan woman, or the time Jesus is actually times. There's a number of times he's teaching in and around the temple. So these are all longer discourses. The synoptics have a tendency to emphasize future prophecy. Now, that doesn't mean it's all throughout there, but most of the prophetic material that is found in the Gospels is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Not so much John. John has relatively little on future prophecy. There's maybe a phrase here or there, a line here or there, but really not that much. John instead, and this isn't really an outline of John, but I'm just noting that there are 7 signs that are mentioned, 7 miracles, beginning in chapter 2 with the wedding feast at Cana, where Jesus turns water to wine. But notice the symmetry here. In John chapter 2, where he turns water into wine, that's a funeral. I'm sorry, that's a wedding, excuse me. You go to the very last one in John chapter 11, verses 1 through 44. That is a funeral. So you begin with a wedding and you end with a funeral where Lazarus is raised. Notice the second one where there is a healing. The nobleman's son is healed in chapter 4, verses 46 through 54. Go to chapter 9, verses 1 through 41. Another healing. The blind man sees. Uh, Notice chapter 5, where a lame man at the he's at the pool of Bethesda, there on the north side of the temple. So there's a lame man, but notice the presence of the water. That's the symmetry there. And in John chapter 6, verse 16, Jesus walks on water. So there's water involved in both miracles. And the central, sort of the pivotal one, where he feeds the 5,000. Now, there's teaching given all throughout that, but I'm just focusing upon the sign because John himself, as the author, at the end of his gospel account, he says, there's many things that Jesus did, but these signs are written, these things are written so that you might believe. And we're meant to see these signs through the eyes of the disciples, and they're said as they see these signs, we see they believed, and then they believed again, and they believed more, and they're growing in their belief as they see the signs. And as we are reading the signs, we're meant to grow with them. Now, I want to talk a bit about sermons in the Gospels. And as we come to sermons, notice you have the original speaker and the original audience. The original audience might be a number of people, like, for example, when Jesus is speaking to the people that are in the temple in John chapter 5, or sometimes it might be just a few. Jesus speaking to Nicodemus and whoever else was there. You say, why do you say whoever else was there? Wasn't it just Jesus and Nicodemus by himself? It perhaps was, but when Jesus says, for example, to Nicodemus, you must be born again. I like the way the King James says, ye must be born again. The reason it says ye is because that's plural. So we would say if you were in Georgia or Alabama, you would say y'all must be born again. He's speaking to a plural, to a plurality of audience. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that there were other people there. It might have been Nicodemus representing the Jewish people, or for example, all of mankind. But he does speak to him in the plural there. So you have the original speaker, and notice the question that we ask is what attitude is displayed in that sermon, in that narrative. For example, as Jesus is speaking to Nicodemus, the attitude he's giving him is sort of, wait a second, you should know this. I don't think it's frustration, but it's, Nicodemus, this is real basic. You ought to know this. There's more to teach you, but you're not quite ready for that. And so there's that attitude. When we get to Jesus and the Samaritan woman, I think there's a real tenderness as Jesus breaks the bonds of what would normally be seen, and he addresses her, and she's rather skeptical at first. But you look at her attitude as it changes. She starts off, well, you're just a Jew, and why are you talking to me, a Samaritan? And then a little bit later, she says, well, you're a prophet. And then later on, when Jesus says, she says something about the Messiah, and Jesus says, well, you're talking to him. And by the end, she's not just convinced that Jesus is the Messiah. She goes back into town to tell everybody else about it. And so there's a attitude that has grown and developed. Sometimes there's a hostile attitude, but we always ask what attitude is being displayed on both the part of the speaker as well as on the part of the original audience. So what attitude is there before the sermon? What attitude is there during the sermon as they are hearing? Sometimes it's argumentative. I think of John chapter 7, for example, is there's argumentation where they're accusing, actually chapter 7 and 8. It's all, I started to say it's all the same sermon. Actually, it's all the same sermon period, or it's over space over 2 days. But what's the attitude during the sermon? And then after the sermon, what is the attitude? Has it changed, like I said about the Samaritan woman? What did the audience already know? Now, that's an important question because there's always an assumed knowledge. For example, as Jesus is speaking to Nicodemus, he says to him, wait a minute, you're a ruler of Israel. You ought to know some of these things already. And the things about Jewish culture, when we're talking about the sermons of Jesus, he's speaking almost entirely to a Jewish audience who will understand what he's saying. Now, what sometimes happens, and Mark likes to do this especially, I'm sorry, Matthew, not Mark. Matthew will quote part of an Old Testament passage, but he won't quote all of it. And you, the reader, are supposed to remember it and fill in the blanks. For example, if I say, "Oh, say, can you see?" You know, if you're from the United States at least, you know the next line. You know what that's talking about: a Star Spangled Banner and about the American flag. And all I have to give you is the first part of that, and you know what comes next. In Matthew's gospel account, that happens where we're given sometimes just part of a verse, and you're supposed to know the context. And if you go, man, if you don't, just go look it up. And when you look it up, sometimes you'll see something referenced that is connected. It's supposed to tell you the rest of the story. And that's deliberate. I really do think that's deliberate. So, what did the audience know? What did they know before the sermon? They already had pre-knowledge, and that's always the case. And then also, what did they know after the sermon, and how did their attitudes change as a result? So, what did they learn? Say they already had some things. I think another example of this question is in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15, where Jesus is talking about the fall of Jerusalem, and then he says, "When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place." And then he says, almost in parentheses, and most translations actually put parentheses there, um, let the reader understand, because they would understand. They'd say, wait a minute, wasn't that referenced back in Daniel, in Daniel chapter 9 and Daniel chapter 11, this abomination of desolation? And Matthew actually adds the phrase, let the reader understand, because they would have said, wait a minute, that was already fulfilled 200 years ago. And Jesus is saying it's going to have a future fulfillment. And so that's a puzzle to be unraveled. So the original audience now is supposed to read that and say, there's something future. That's not just something that happened as a footnote in the past, but where there was this evil ruler that came into Israel and set up an abomination of desolation, but that it would happen again in the future. Now, we ask the question, did the sermon cause a corresponding reaction on the part of the hearers? You have the original speaker and then the original audience, but then also we have the person who's writing the story. You see, Jesus is the one who would give the sermon, but then either Matthew or Mark or Luke or John, who is writing to his original readers, and are they going to have the same reaction as the original audience? That's, of course, you don't know that until you've put your feet into the sandals of the original readers. Are they going to react with hostility, or are they going to react, hopefully, with faith? And so we consider the setting of the gospel, the historical setting at the time of the delivery of the discourse. Of course, Matthew is careful to give us those 5 sermons and tell us a little story leading up to that, but he's not the only one that does that. Even though you don't have five specific sermons. By the way, when he does 5, as a Jewish reader, you're supposed to think, wait a minute, where have I heard that number 5? There are 5 books in the Torah, and 5 is a very important number to the Jewish ear. And so he would get that this is the one who's giving us God's law. And there's all sorts of things like that in Matthew. So the historical setting at the time of the delivery of the discourse, and also the literary setting within the book. How is the book led up to this? What has either Matthew or Mark or Luke or John, how have they brought us to this point? And sometimes you'll see certain patterns that are set up within the book itself, but then also the setting at the time of the writing of the book. Because remember, it's not being written at the same time the sermon's being preached. All historical writing, and the Gospels are historical, all historical writing has to be written after the event. So first the event took place, and then it's written at a later date. It might be a long time later. It might be just a few weeks. In this case, it's probably a few years, maybe a number of years. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I think, my own suspicion is that all 3 of those are written before the fall of Jerusalem, and maybe John as well. We're not entirely sure about John. But I think that it's entirely possible that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and maybe even John are all written before the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, which means that they're written within 40 years of the events having taken place, but not exactly at the same time. So there has been some time that has passed in at least some of those cases. Now, literary analysis. There's always an introduction to a sermon. You know, what sets it off? How does it begin? There's sometimes an attention getter that grabs the individual's attention, that gets them to hear. I think of Luke chapter 4 that starts off with a reading of the scriptures, and remember how Jesus goes into Nazareth and he opens the scripture and reads, and then he begins to speak to them, the discourse that takes place. Sometimes it's a series of questions or objections that have been raised. I think of Jesus when he is in Jerusalem speaking to the scribes and the Pharisees, and they're throwing questions at him, and then at the end he gives one to them, or in Matthew 24, where he's been rejected, and now he goes out to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples have been saying, "Hey, look at all these cool things in the temple." And Jesus says, "Not one stone going to be left upon another." And they say, "Well, when's that going to take place?" And now he gives them a 2-chapter sermon to answer their question. Sometimes there's a contrast of authority where Jesus has authority, and yet he's speaking to those who are claiming to be in authority, religious leaders and things like that. So we can see that in the sermon. There are repeated phrases and or concepts, and your job in hermeneutics is to look for those significant repeated phrases and or concepts. Um, for example, we look at Matthew chapter 6, and there the repeated phrase is various references to reward. He has, you've been rewarded in full. When you give alms, don't do it in public because then you have your reward. And then Jesus goes on to talk about finances and rewards and things like that. So just circle every time you see one of those. Matthew chapter 18, verses 1 through 20, where it speaks of stumbling and both in the teaching that Jesus gives, don't cause these little ones to stumble, but then he goes on to speak about when someone has something against you and you go to that person, um, and you see if you can correct it with them so that they don't stumble, and so that stumbling theme goes through most of that chapter. There is Luke chapter 11, verses 1 through 13 that talk about giving. And anytime you see a reference there to give, just circle it in your Bible. By the way, as a practical point, I recommend taking Crayola pencils because they erase if you make a mistake and they don't bleed through the paper. That they can be very effective. So a little commercial break there. Another example of this is Luke chapter 12, verses 1 through 40, that have the theme of anxiety and fear and how you should be trusting the Lord. So anytime you see that the term anxiety or fear in that chapter, just circle it. It'll make it jump out at you, and you'll see how that thread goes through the passage. Luke chapter 16, remember that's the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, but it starts off with several parables dealing with finances and money, and then it goes into that. And so there's sort of a, remember he's the rich man, and so and it tells you as he's about to give that parable, Jesus addressed the Pharisees who were lovers of money. And so circle that because those things all connect that chapter together. John chapter 8, verses 31 through 58. There's a father theme where the question is, who's your daddy? Who's your father? And they're saying, our father is Abraham. And he says, well, my father is one who went before Abraham. And he says how the father and I are one. And so there's a number of father things that are mentioned in that section. Is there a theme that runs through the entire discourse? Sometimes these, and I've given you some of them as we've looked at these key and repeated words that will give you a hint of the common theme that can run through that discourse, although in some cases that might just be part of a larger discourse. But look for the theme. Look for I guess you could call it the sermon title. And I know some of your study Bibles give little titles to sections, and they're trying to be helpful, and that's okay. But I'm going to urge you, as a student of hermeneutics, as a student of how to study the Bible, that you look for those yourself.